Hi class, and welcome to Module 1, Understanding Abnormal Behavior. This week, we're going to define what mental disorders are, explore how they've been classified throughout history, and also explore one of the most complicated questions. What do we mean by abnormal behavior? When you hear the term psychological disorder, what comes to mind? Some people might think of distressing thoughts, paranoia. Others might think of deviant behavior, and some might think of the risk of danger, like those associated with suicidal ideation. The word abnormal, at its core, comes from the Latin meaning away from the norm. And that's really what we'll explore in this week's module. What goes against the norm and what even is considered normal? So what is normal? Is it what most people do? Is it what's socially acceptable? And how does this all relate to health? Let's take sleeping patterns, for example. In some cultures, sleeping in segments, like taking an afternoon nap and then sleeping through the night, is seen as normal. In other cultures, that might be going against the norm, and it might not be as common to take a nap. Even within one culture, for example, thinking back to your early childhood, it probably was a lot more common for you to take a nap every day than it is now at your current age. And even if a nap right now sounds like it would be amazing, it's probably not something that's happening every day. It's against the norm, but is it abnormal? My point here is that abnormality really isn't a fixed category. It's always going to be relative to cultural, historical, and situational norms. Before we look deeper into how abnormal psychology is defined today, let's take a look at how people have explained mental illness over time. Throughout history, people have looked to different explanations for abnormal behavior. Ancient cultures often saw mental illness as possession by evil spirits, curses, or the result of displeasing the gods. Treatments reflected this with rituals like exorcism or trepanation, where holes were drilled into the skull to release evil spirits. Then we have more somatogenic theories, where the body was thought to be the cause of mental illness. Hippocrates, for example, linked mental illness to imbalances of bodily fluids or humors. And with psychogenic theories, we look at more psychological and social roots as the cause of mental illness. For example, trauma and major life stressors can contribute to mental illness. These three theories of mental illness still influence us today, and you'll notice echoes of each theory in our modern approach to mental health. Today, when we look at defining abnormal psychology, we really view things from this biopsychosocial model, which considers both biological predispositions, psychological stressors, and social context in determining what is abnormal. Psychologists often use 4 guidelines to describe what is abnormal: deviance, distress, dysfunction, and danger. Deviants are the behaviors, thoughts, or emotions that differ sharply from social norms. For example, hearing voices when none are present. But deviance doesn't on its own equal disorder. Creative geniuses are deviant. Distress refers to how much suffering a person is experiencing. If a person's experiencing a lot of anxiety, sadness, intense fear, this may be a sign of a mental disorder. Dysfunction refers to how much symptoms interfere with day-to-day functioning. If school, work, and social relationships are impacted, it's a significant dysfunction to the person's life. For example, the mental illness depression can make it significantly hard to get out of bed, even remember to brush your teeth every day. And the last category of danger refers to when a person's behavior poses a risk to themselves or another person's safety. Now, these are guidelines, not hard rules. If we look at grief, for example, when somebody loses a loved one, they may experience a significant amount of distress and disruption to their normal day-to-day functioning. But we would consider grief a normal human response to losing a loved one, not a sign of abnormality. Some behaviors are going to fit into these categories, but not be considered disorders. It's important to remember that culture defines what is deviant. For example, talking to one's ancestors might be a sign of psychosis in one culture, but in another, it could be a very valid spiritual experience. Danger is also relative. Sports like martial arts, boxing, football can be dangerous, but they also can be fun to participate in or even watch for entertainment purposes. My takeaway here is that definitions of abnormality are shaped by context and our values, not just science. When determining what is a disorder, we can also look to the DSM, or the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. Published by the American Psychiatric Association, this is the primary diagnostic manual in the US. It describes each disorder, criteria for diagnosis, prevalence rates, and risk factors. If we're looking at how the DSM defines a mental disorder, we're looking at a syndrome characterized by clinically significant disturbance in an individual's cognition, emotional regulation, or behavior that reflects a dysfunction in psychological, biological, or developmental processes. That's a mouthful. So the key points we're looking at here are clinical significance, dysfunction, and disturbance. We're not just talking about personality quirks or mild distress. We're talking about something significant enough to interfere with a person's life. The diagnostic process of determining what makes something disordered, according to the DSM, is going to involve clinical interviews, mental status exams done by psychiatrists or doctors, determining what a principal diagnosis may be, also considering comorbidities or other diagnoses that may go along with the principal diagnosis, and developing culturally informed case formulations and treatment plans. But even the DSM admits that there is no single definition of abnormal that can capture the full range of mental disorders. When it comes to diagnosing disorders, it's important to remember that labels can be double-edged swords. They can help people get treatment, but they can also create stigma. Stigma might take the form of public stigma, like negative stereotypes in society, might take the form of self-stigma, or it can also take the form of structural stigma when systems and policies disadvantage people with mental illness. One theme we will return to time and again in this course is stigma. Stigma is not just an attitude, it's a barrier to treatment and recovery. It can lower self-esteem, block employment or housing, and even impact someone's physical health. That's why we'll explore using person-first language and recovery-oriented language in this class. Instead of labeling someone as schizophrenic, we would say a person living with schizophrenia. These small language shifts can reduce stigma and affirm that people are so much more than their diagnosis. There's an article I shared in Canvas that I'd like you to read by Sickle and colleagues. It's titled Mental Health Stigma Update, a Review of Consequences. This review looks at what stigma is, how it works, and why it matters. These attitudes don't just exist in the abstract. They have real consequences in people's lives. The authors of this review outline how stigma impacts multiple areas of functioning in one's life and really create a ripple effect on self-perception, where people may internalize stigma and then in turn have lower self-esteem and self-efficacy, making it harder to believe that recovery is possible. Stigma can show up in relationships, starting to erode social support. Even with families that are supportive, if a healthcare system is stigmatizing, it can really make people feel isolated. And then, of course, there's the impact that stigma has on physical and mental health. People with mental illness often experience worse overall health outcomes, partly because stigma reduces treatment seeking and treatment adherence. Stigma is a major barrier to seeking help. Some people avoid treatment altogether because they fear outright being judged by others, while others may delay care until symptoms become really severe because they think that they're not sick enough to warrant seeking help. And even though the research is mixed on whether stigma directly predicts treatment behavior, research does show that stigma consistently appears as a heavy influence in how people think about, approach, and stick with treatment. After you have a chance to read the article, take some time to think about what stood out to you most in that review. Which consequence of stigma do you believe has the greatest impact on someone's daily life, and why? So why are we spending so much time on definitions? Well, because how we define abnormality shapes everything else, shapes who gets diagnosed, who receives treatment, and how society views people living with mental health challenges. If we define abnormality too broadly, we pathologize normal human experience. If we define abnormality too narrowly, people in need may not get care. Your job as a student in this class is to think about abnormal psychology critically, remain compassionate, and always remember the human being behind a diagnosis. In the rest of this module, you'll see that abnormal psychology is more than just a list of disorders. It's an entire field shaped by history, culture, science, and most importantly, compassion. As we move forward, remember, the way we define and label behavior matters because it shapes treatment, recovery, and people's lived experience.